you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and I'm extremely grateful to the Centre and indeed the Business School for having invited me here to what is in fact my first visit to New Zealand. So all these years I've never been here. I'm here actually to try and get a few different perspectives on the Middle East, because as Basil said in presenting me, we tend to look at these things very much from a Eurocentric perspective. When we talk about the West, we think of US policy, European policy, and we don't tend to think of anybody or anything very much else apart from that. So I think that correction, I've already been here 2 or 3 days, has already been made. And I also apologise, I did prepare a script because I wasn't quite sure how well I would do just talking ad lib over 50 minutes. I'm normally involved in policy discussions where everybody is so well versed in what's happening. We tend to be discussing the finer detail, you know, the detail of names and individuals who are involved in these things. And I did actually want to capture a few key points. So I will start with this script, and I think it will be available to you afterwards, which is also a benefit, I think, of having something written you can go back to. But I will start by saying that developments in the Middle East are neither all good nor all bad, even as the negatives dominate our news screens. Whether Syria and Iraq, Yemen or Gaza, religion, sectarianism, Sunni-Shia divides, all of these characterize images of the Middle East, along with the rise of violent jihadism since the 1980s. And I should stress, it is the 1980s, it particularly came to the fore, not last year, in the form of Al-Qaeda and most dramatically ISIS, or as others call it, ISIL, most dramatically since 2014, when it took over an area of Iraq, roughly the size, at the beginning it was Belgium, and now it's roughly the size of the United Kingdom. Now, tempting though it is to focus the whole of this lecture on ISIS, I'll examine it in the much broader context of what I will argue are the creaking and uneven changes in a region that can no longer sustain itself on the received wisdoms and ways of doing business that its current political systems have for too long taken for granted. And maybe the subtitle of this, and perhaps any lecture on the current state of the Middle East, should be "The Middle East is an Unholy Mess." And this is one way of saying that the drivers of the current forms of Islamist-inspired jihadism are far from being pious, or even particularly religious, except in their own terms. Much debate continues over how representative, in fact, any of these movements are of the essential tenets of Islamic thought, or how far their ideology should be seen as secondary to their political motivations. But it's also the case that they don't exist in isolation from other religiously motivated forces in the region. To cite only the Muslim Brotherhood, who, I have a helpful little map here, was in charge of Egypt until 2013. And indeed, the Wahhabi version of Sunni Islam, which dominates Saudi Arabia, and indeed the Shia Islamic theocracy, as we think of it, which dominates Iran. What I'm interested in focusing on here is what the emergence of jihadist movements tell us about what's happened in the region since the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring, you probably all know about, kicked off in 2011 and was essentially a movement of led by largely middle-class educated people, but with others joining in as it gained momentum to demand democracy. And the impact of the failure of those movements actually to install or set in train democracy in more than a few states. And one of the success stories, where's my little mirror here, is Tunisia. And in fact, I've just been, you see how small Tunisia is, but that's where it started. And I would argue because of the proximity of Tunisia to Europe in many ways, and the fact that it's already had a long institutional and democratic, or at least constitutional background, it has now, 3-4 years on, agreed a new constitution and indeed a new government. So there is some stability there. But in the rest of the region, as we've seen, I mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. After 2 years in government, they failed to deliver on any of the goods, and indeed they were elected, but they seem to be, or feel that they'd been elected to rule on behalf of their own people rather than the whole state, and what had previously been a military state actually kicked back and kicked the Muslim Brotherhood out and has taken over since. Now, I could go around the whole region saying where uprisings have not exactly succeeded, but I think I'll spare you spare you all the damage. But the impact of all these developments on the longer term stability of a region, which is currently, I would argue, in its very early stages of working through its own internal conflicts, is of course hard to predict. But I'm not amongst those who consider that the Arab Spring turned winter is now completely over, not least since its structural causes have still to be fully addressed, and will simmer beneath the surface until they find some resolution. And the two key factors here, even though the prominence of democracy demands and political demands were those that grabbed the headlines, it seems to be the two key factors that are structural rather than contingent and passing. Unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, combined with the demographic youth bulge, which has come of age over the past decade. Now, both of these factors spell social volatility, which in large part explains why and who took part in the Arab Spring. But it's also a factor which is vulnerable to the kind of simple solutions offered by ISIS and those of its simplifying ilk, who present ideologies which start by saying Islam is the solution. Well, that may be the case, but you have to spell out the details. It's also the case that this demographic, because the young are traditionally have higher unemployment than those older and entrenched, if you like, largely in public sector jobs, the risk is not just radicalization, but the younger generations find themselves captured by criminal networks or the underground economy, which in some states, and particularly in the most densely populated, again, Algeria, Morocco feature here as well as Egypt. Egypt is 85 million, and they live just up and down the Nile. Algeria is around 36 to 38, Morocco slightly less, 35 million people. The criminal networks which are engaged in trafficking where things are prohibited, but sometimes this parallel economy rivals official economies by as much as 40 to 50% of official GDP. So when we talk about official unemployment rates, certainly during the crisis in Europe, where in Spain, for example, youth unemployment went as high as 57%. I was quite amused when my partners and colleagues in the Arab world said, we've got 25% unemployment. But what the reality is, certainly in the youth it was always higher, is a lot of this is disguised by people being semi-employed and underemployed. But it's in a precarious situation with no social services. They obviously don't pay taxes, but in the kind of exploitative situation, which actually, and the lack of dignity, if you remember the Arab Spring kicked off when a young trader set fire to himself and committed suicide in Tunisia because he'd been slapped by a local policewoman. That sense of indignity is what kick-started the Arab Spring, and unless we address it, it's going to come back and haunt us. And whatever political winds of social change blow across the region, it seems to me everyone's focus now has to be on this generation and how they will shape the region's future. And in the interim, it's the older generation that still wields power and has reacted in a number of ways, either to accommodate or stem the protest movement unleashed in 2011. But the biggest tendency has been to crack down on it and to repress it and to try and displace political demands down the road. Now, in looking at this, it's very difficult to avoid overgeneralizations. Again, I could spend a whole hour going around the region telling you exactly what's going on where. But let's start by giving you an old truth about the region and perhaps politics in general, is that what states and their leaders say in public is not necessarily a reflection of what they're doing in private. And in the current unholy mess, this aspect of the region has become even more accentuated. So what I'll do then is start with an overview of my own thinking about where the region is heading. So we've briefly covered the past here, and then try to substantiate some of it in more detail, and I'd love to do this in discussion with the questions you have. I'm also aware that one of the focuses here is on the impacts of what's happening on global energy security, which of course is not my area of expertise, but on which I can offer some thoughts based on the internal and sub-regional security profiles of the main oil producers in the Gulf, which is this lot you probably know over there. Am I pointing in the right direction? Look how close Saudi Arabia is to Iran. We'll come back to that. As will be seen, again, I think one of the things that have changed since the Arab Spring is that it's no longer possible to ring-fence the individual states and societies of the Middle East from the impacts of what's happening further afield and indeed globally. And I know when I started my career, there was a whole subsection of students of the Arab-Israeli peace process, the Arab-Israeli conflict. And actually what went on around them, Israel and Palestine being these tiny little contested bit here, never seemed to have any impact. Now you can't talk about even developments in Morocco, which is heavily tied into the Gulf and is funded by the Gulf in many ways. You can't talk about any part of this region without reference to the rest. Now that is something new. It could be a good sign, but until things settle down, it's not necessarily a good sign, because it signifies the interference of other states in the affairs of other places. And the Syrian crisis, I think you've probably seen what's been happening in Syria, has attracted the direct involvement of all its immediate regional neighbours, as well as further afield, China, Russia, Iran, the US and Europe as usual, and a whole series of UN agencies. And as an extension of this, another of the distinctly new developments in the Middle East since 2011 has been the extent to which external players other than the traditional West, meaning, as I mentioned before, the US and its allies in Europe. It used to be the West who decided what happened in the Middle East. If you remember the era of Pax Americana, which the US imposed after having galvanized forces together to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait in 1990-91. That era, I think, bit the dust with the US invasion, or US-led invasion, I should say. There was an international coalition, which my nation was one. But the US-led invasion of Iraq, I think, was part of the demise of this era, for reasons I'll come on to. And if we look particularly at Syria, it has complicated anyone's attempt to resolve things. We see more than the immediate neighbours, all of whom who have ideas about how to resolve Syria, whether they're on the side of President Assad remaining in force or whether they're against him. And to add to this, we now have the direct involvement of states such as Russia, which has defended President Bashar al-Assad both from its position on the UN Security Council, when the US and others have tried to unify the international community with UN backing to confront and deal with Assad's indiscriminate and sometimes targeting of his own civilians. It has been Russia, swiftly accompanied by China, which has blocked these initiatives. It's been Russia, however, that when there was talk of a red line having been crossed and the US engaging in airstrikes against Assad's military forces, that it was actually Russia who suggested instead and persuaded Assad to give up his chemical weapons stockpile, so thereby avoiding direct action against them. And China, in turn, China is not notably seen as a key actor in this region except as an investor, and has been heavily involved in recent years, not directly related to the Arab Spring, but in major infrastructure projects as a contractor as well as an investor. But China too is a member of the UN Security Council Permanent 5 and joined Russia in blocking attempts to restrain Assad, on the basis that when the UN Security Council, with Russian and China's backing, agreed to certain resolutions in sequence over Libya, this led directly to the assumption by other parties, the British, French and Americans, that that entitled the outside world to assist directly, indirectly, in the removal of Muammar Gaddafi. And for reasons of their own, the Chinese and Russians are very averse to the idea of regime change and have blocked any suggestion or any resolution that might lead to that sense. Now, as I've mentioned earlier, the Arab Spring did not necessarily cause this shift in geopolitical realities, but it certainly accelerated a growing realization that since, as I mentioned earlier, the US-led invasion of Iraq, the West, as traditionally conceived, can no longer effect major political or strategic changes in isolation of their own global interests and factors. It's entirely new, for example, that at least since the end of the Cold War, for the US and Europe to be contending with Russia in both the Ukraine and Syria. Normally, when outside powers from Europe and the US have focused on the Middle East, they've been able to ignore others. Too many alternatives now exist for regional actors and individual states to actually resist the force of American diplomacy, and the idea, as we've seen in recent years, of a fully fledged US-American military intervention is now almost definitively, although never say never, off the cards. And the domestic factors which have limited the actions of Western powers are also well known in the region and have also been exploited to individual advantage by regional leaderships on a number of occasions even before 2011. And the first of these, of course, is the 2007-08 financial crisis, which has given the wealthy Gulf states, above all, a level of leverage over cash-strapped Europe, which they didn't exercise quite so boldly to 2011. There's also a lively competition, you're probably aware of, between Western allies to secure arms sales contracts in the Gulf. And this has also impacted on the US's margin for manoeuvre when they too, before they moved away from the financial crisis, were looking for foreign export contracts. And a second change arising directly from the Arab Spring is also the realization that this region is much more diverse, internally, externally, than previous characterizations and generalizations about the Arab world actually used to present. I think we're now moving to an era in which, when we talk about the Middle East, and we already talk about the Middle East and North Africa, that we can't make the kind of generalizations that we do now about Arabs, about Muslims, about Middle Eastern Arabs and Muslims, because they're all moving in slightly different ways, and these for reasons of historical development. If you look at the states of North Africa, I've already mentioned, many of them speak French almost better. In fact, in Algeria, I once said salam alaikum in Arabic to an Algerian minister who immediately asked me in French, Madame, do you speak French? Because his Arabic, my Arabic's bad, but his Arabic was worse than mine. He only spoke French. This is a factor which you won't find everywhere across the region, but the links into Europe, which are often seen, and certainly the colonial links with France were often depicted as a negative, in many ways, when it comes to changing and moving on, have become a positive because it's a conduit, it's a way into Europe. And what is interesting now is there's a whole younger generation who suddenly, we realized at the time of the Arab Spring, had both within the country but also through travel and study overseas, had learned English. And there's a simple reason for this, nothing to do with Britain, partly to do with the US, but English as the language of globalization, of interaction, particularly on social media and the internet, was suddenly an attractive option. And as one of my colleagues, the former director of the British Council in Morocco, pointed out to me, French, even though it was a vehicle for the older generation to engage with Europe, it was seen very much as the language of the elites, whereas the poorer population were always taught in rather bad Arabic, which disqualified them from getting any jobs in the French language-dominated economy. They found a solution to this, which is to get rid of both, speak English. And now, under pressure of students and a pressure of the needs of economic development, now the university sector in Morocco, amazingly, is going to be taught in English. They are transforming the whole educational sector precisely because of the need to create jobs. And as a result of this, because of all the negatives, I mean, we could talk endlessly about the problems in this region, there are many, But there is also a small, if not yet perfectly formed, generation of educated graduates across the region who are not only ready but keen to move their countries and region into a more constructive and equal relationship with the outside world. Many of these, as I say, have studied abroad, even lived abroad, despite the difficulties which are increasing of getting visas. There are programs of student exchanges between the region and Europe, but there is a clampdown because of security reasons, more than anything else, on allowing students into the region. But there are also pre-existing strong links with diaspora communities. We have a very big Arab diaspora community, representing virtually all of them. Indeed, the Kurds, when we had a meeting on the Kurdish areas of Iraq, suddenly we had 250 of them in a room in Chatham House, very vocal, all of whom who live somewhere in North London and orthodontists or something of the ilk. But everyone has got some kind of link outside. And this, when they were in opposition, certainly to what's going on in the region, has been an asset and a point of contact for those who don't feel that things are changing fast enough in the region. And I make this point because the paradox is these sort of people, when it comes to talking about the geopolitical dimensions of the region, barely get mentioned. It's almost like living in two different worlds. When I go to meetings in London talking about the economic development and business startups and incubators and small and medium enterprises, these people are very present, they're talked about, everything is very dynamic. And the usual question is, what about funding models? What about regulation? When you're talking about the security challenges, or when you're talking about the overall politics, it's all about how many of them are hidden radicals, Islamists, terrorists. And I think we need in our own discussions more of a convergence over not singling out or demonizing people who, frankly, if they are blocked and profiled as potential terrorists, I'm not saying they will all become them, but there is a way, this is the path towards marginalizing and isolating people, and without going into the recruitment of foreign jihadists, I think there's plenty of studies on this. And in this context, I'm not sure many people know that women in Saudi Arabia set up more startup SME companies last year than their equivalents in Europe or the US. Now, there are social reasons for this, that for women, there are more women graduates in Saudi Arabia than there are men. The women, funny enough, do better at university. Isn't that funny? Women? Very strange. Women always get better grades at university. They do better. But there's a huge problem of unemployment for social reasons. That in Saudi Arabia, which is very socially conservative, women are expected, after they graduate, to get married, go home, not work. One way they can work is through the internet, set up a startup company from home so that they can combine that. And hopefully also through that employ others in the same way. But I think that is something that we don't talk about enough. Again, the stereotype of Saudi women is they're veiled, repressed, not allowed to drive. As one of my Saudi colleagues says, I don't need to drive, I have a chauffeur. Because of this, in my policy discussions, and I'm not often giving lectures, but I'm often in seminars where we're trying to tease out what we should do, my main message to European and US officials is that we do now need to see considerably more backing than has materialized so far for turning the economies of the Middle East into genuinely vibrant market economies. And this is not, as is often supposed, and I'm often criticised for, an invitation to support the worst of the predatory capitalist systems which have passed for a private sector in many Arab states. It's rather an invitation to restructure the West's bilateral relations, Europe's in particular, on the bilateral relations with individual states in the region on an entirely different and more expansive footing. Otherwise, the region will fall back on the kind of crony capitalism that actually provoked much of the original Arab Spring protests. And what's needed now, especially for Europe, which is at risk, if not already, reaping the worst rewards of neglected societies, which in the case of Spain, as we can see over there, is only 14 kilometers away from Morocco. And you may have heard of a number of migrants, mostly sub-Saharans actually, breaking into the Spanish enclave of Ceuta and Melilla, the two of them, and trying to get into Spain and Europe that way, that we have to have a much better sense of co-development and joining forces in addressing what in Spain, you may have seen, is still a financial crisis with very high levels of youth unemployment. There must be ways in which solutions to the problems on both sides are done in ways that mutually benefit both sides. And the rationale for actually engaging first and foremost on the economic side is the same as it has been here in the US and in Europe, namely that without the emergence of genuinely autonomous private sectors, fully delinked from the personalised networks of power that stymie the full application of the rule of law, and it's also been the case in the Middle East that most people already work and want to work in the public sector for overinflated ministries because it provides security of jobs. But if you continue down that path, you will never really see full democracy, since only an active civic population whose income and well-being does not entirely depend on the state will be able to hold their own political leaders to account in the way that we all aspire to do in our own democracies. And despite having some way to go to prepare for these changes, the Arab Spring, it seems to me, has at least opened up the possibilities for a much closer understanding of the economic underpinnings needed to consolidate democracy and for us to engage on that ground alone. It's not just a question of creating jobs for the sake of it. It has to be a transformational exercise. And then a final, I think it will maybe final, it's certainly another change I think will endure from the Arab Springs is that it demonstrated to the world a great surge of creativity, above all in local affiliations. And I've already mentioned the links into Europe, but there is an amazing creativity across the whole region. And one of the myths, if you like, that has been broken in the process is that the Arab world is in fact exclusively or indeed very Arab at all. Now, I've already hinted at the Kurds. Let me show you where all the Kurds are, if I can actually see. The Kurds straddle 4 states, bits of Iraq, bits of Syria, bits of Iran. And actually, they were the great leftovers, if you like, of the settlements, the Sykes-Picot and all, after the First World War, who did not gain a state. They are now living, certainly in northern Iraq, in an autonomous region which has escaped the worst of the damage. I mean, they're now coming under threat by ISIS, etc. But they very cleverly, after the demise of Saddam Hussein, signed contracts with the Turks, and certainly Erbil and Suleimani, which are the 2 main towns, have seen something of a mini Gulf boom. They even have mini Burj Al Arab, you know, mini towers that they have built there. There is enormous dynamism in this part of the world, and they're not Arabs, but they are within the Arab world. It's also the case, going back to this end of the region, that at least 50% of Morocco is Berber. The Berbers are the indigenous people. In Algeria, it's 25%. All these identities are coming much more to the fore and are significant in getting away and creating alternatives, as well as different relationships with Europe, which a younger generation who did not grow up or even know directly French colonial rule, or indeed in Jordan, where they don't have any recollection of the British having been in control. They basically have a completely open-minded, they are much more pragmatic about where to go next. And much of what they have discussed and debated, as we know, has taken place on the social media, and you've probably heard discussions already about the immediate and important role that social media played in actually kicking off the Arab Spring. But the same social media, we should be aware now, has been revealing a darker side to developments and have been used not just to spread the jihadist ideologies of ISIS, but have also served the purposes of an anti-democratic backlash against the honeymoon period of free speech which prevailed in the 2 or 3 years after the Arab Spring. And where central governments, and here we're talking particularly in the Gulf, but also in Egypt, sadly, where we remember the Tahrir Square activists, increasing numbers of bloggers, activists, journalists have been arrested, as most prominently seen in the trials, imprisonment and subsequent release, thank goodness, of the Al Jazeera journalists in Egypt over the past year. And this is certainly a setback, but just as the Arab Spring itself demonstrated that it could escape official attempts to exert exclusive control over the media, so this clampdown, I think, is only a step in a much longer story of confrontation and accommodation eventually. And my hunch is that most of the Tahrir Square activists, of which there were several million, who have not actually left Egypt, found themselves arrested, have actually gone underground and will re-emerge in another guise at a later date. Some of them obviously have been irrevocably disappointed and some have emigrated, but the silence that currently reigns over what many of them we do or don't know are happening should not be taken as a sign that they're completely out of the game. They will re-emerge. I think they are regrouping and thinking that leaderless revolts was clearly not the way forward. And at the public and geopolitical level, which I'll move on to next, which is the relations between the governments of the region, things, as you probably may have seen, have become extremely complex and fraught, even where they apparently support the same objectives. This is in itself a relatively new sign of regional diplomatic activism, which has taken the place of a long-standing expectation that the US and its allies will determine or direct regional outcomes, as they did at the time of the invasion of Iraq. And these same regional leaderships, and here we're thinking primarily of the Gulf states, who are the wealthiest, have long been urged by successive US administrations to assume responsibility for their own neighbourhoods, but this is not exactly what's emerged. Not only have a new set of non-state actors, not just the jihadists, but others who have had influence, whether it's in the private sector or elsewhere, not only have they had more leverage over the direction of events, but official responses to events have actually been more defensive and ad hoc than reflective of any sign of enlightened leadership. So what's happened essentially is in the Gulf states, they have no interest in democracy or democratization, and they feared greatly, and they were extremely angry with the US for having supported the demise of President Mubarak in Egypt, who was a strong ally previously of the Gulf states. So what has grown up out of this is an unofficial alliance between Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait and Jordan. So Saudi being the big one, and then I think some of them are missing, aren't they? United Emirates, Kuwait, Jordan. So this lot, who are largely Sunni, in fact exclusively, except for minorities, Arab Sunni states. They have joined together to oppose the Muslim Brotherhood, who were elected to govern Egypt in 2011-12, and who were unseated by a coup. The Egyptians who've taken over since don't like the word coup, but it was a military coup. The C word is banned in Egypt. And they have been arrested, many have been sentenced to death, they have been repressed, but they still represent about 30%, an estimate of 30% of the voting population. So these states put money into the region, they put money into combating the Muslim Brotherhood, at the same time as other states, such as Turkey and Qatar, financially supported the Muslim Brotherhood because, as you probably know, the AKP in Turkey is itself derived from a Muslim Brotherhood school of Islamist thought. Now these, in theory at least, are the moderate Islamists of the region, the ones who actually want to change things from the ground and through the ballot box and not engage in violence. And some would say they're on the same spectrum, others would say the adoption of what are seen as more Salafi ideologies is from a different source of roots, and is closer in fact to the Wahhabi ideology, the version of Sunni Islam in Saudi Arabia. So there are some complexities here given the suspicions that there are a number of supporters in Saudi Arabia who are behind ISIS and others. Not officially, it's been denied, but private funders have actually facilitated the rise of movements. And because of this, the split, certainly since the advent of violence in Syria, has increased, and it's also accentuated the divisions within the region. And I think even in just recent weeks, we're seeing the possibility of the Saudis having completely vilified the Muslim Brotherhood, actually adopting a rather more moderated line towards them. And in turn, in addition to the battles going on within Sunni Islam, the key winner, if you like, over the last few years has been Iran, who the Iranian regime since 2011 has actually ring-fenced Saudi Arabia in many ways through proxies rather than directly getting involved militarily. And the Saudis are particularly shocked and is now taking a position of being very opposed to the Iranian influence, given that they accuse Iran of allegedly having provoked the 2011 Shia uprisings in the tiny island state of Bahrain, which was one of the first Arab Spring uprisings that was contained and put down. Bahrain, even though it's very small, has a majority Shia Muslim population with a Sunni ruling family, so that they hung on and with the support of the Saudis were able to see off the Shia uprisings. Iran also supports Hezbollah in Lebanon and has been notably alongside with the Russians and in the distant background the Chinese, alongside supporting President Assad against any attempt to unseat him. And this is because Assad, or the Assad family and the Assad regime, come from the Alawite minority in Syria, which is a variation of Shia Islam against a majority which is largely Sunni, which interestingly is the opposite, if we want to go on to Iraq, of Iraq, where 20% of the population are Sunni and the majority, at least of the Arab population, are Shias. And part of the battle against ISIS and the way ISIS has galvanized support is that it accuses the Shia majority government under al-Maliki, the present Prime Minister al-Maliki, who was elected during the time the US was still certainly in control of Iraq, has adopted more of a sectarian pro-Shia Islam agenda at the expense of the Sunni population. And I would say, rather than complicating matters more, I think I'll move on to the energy conclusions next. I would say that sectarianism is something we should be wary of seeing as being entrenched in the region. It is manipulated, operationalized. It is true that people have these identities, but rather like the Catholic-Protestant divide in Christianity is not something which is operationalized in normal societies and yet became absolutely critical in Northern Ireland. It is the context in which these conflicts arise and the way that injustices are embedded in sectarian terms and that people's grievances are unleashed against the other, which is critical here. And it's usually, to my mind, the failure of the states of the region to integrate all its citizens, at least on as equal a basis as possible under the rule of law. Now, most of these states are yet fully run by the rule of law, but historically, the reason sectarian violence hasn't been a norm in the region is that people have been able to accommodate and mediate their differences. And I think what we're seeing increasingly in the Middle East is that that mediation is not taking place, and in fact those who might engage in it, like for example the wealthy Gulf states, are actually exacerbating it by themselves paying for proxies to counter the proxies that they see are being funded and used by Iran on behalf of the Shias. They are actually supporting those who would oppose the Iranians. Now, how much time have I got? I think I should actually say something about the energy equation. Sorry. Yes, the energy equation. Falling oil prices is the critical thing here. And it's been estimated that the Gulf Cooperation Council states, which is the alliance of the major, it's not OPEC, but it's roughly consonant with some of the major Gulf oil exporters, that their budgetary shortfall will be to the tune of $300 billion this year, because the oil price has gradually tumbled from its starry heights of 150 US dollars a barrel to around 60, and in fact below that it's hovering around 60 at the moment. Now, the smaller states who should see a difference between the larger populations of Saudi Arabia, which has 28, just under 29 million people, obviously in a larger landmass. And the smaller states, such as Qatar, who are extremely wealthy and only have an indigenous population of 278,000, but expatriate workers 1.5 million. So there's this tiny minority on top. So when I saw the figure of their GDP per capita was $100,000, I imagine that applies to the indigenous population, not those expatriate workers paid very little to construct the stadiums for the World Cup in 2020. But Saudi Arabia has for a long time, and certainly their main reaction to the Arab Spring was to throw money at it. And this is with reserves of $730 billion from the heyday of high oil prices. They've been able to afford it, but they also have annual budgets of $229 billion, which I would say is roughly a third of their reserves, but that's without counting their income. But they're often regularly exceeded, and while a lot of money has gone into their way of dealing with potential internal dissent and these unemployed women graduates, among other things, was to increase the wages of public servants, public officials and their pension pot. And even with the change of king, this policy is continuing as the new king, after King Abdullah died in January, his half-brother King Salman has just announced yet another pension pot and salary increase. And while a lot of money has been spent on infrastructure, in increasing transport infrastructure, hotels, even building or trying to diversify the economy into petrochemical plants, these are not the sort of areas of the economy that will attract domestic Saudi labour, because they don't work in factories. They are used to living off a generous set of public handouts. This will probably only increase the levels of expatriate workers. And so the stresses, when they come, are likely, as I've already mentioned, Saudi is facing a number of regional stresses, particularly the most recent one being the takeover by some minority Shia Houthi tribesmen of Yemen. Now, Yemen actually had managed peacefully to get rid of its president in 2011, move him aside. They had a long and lengthy national dialogue process. A new president was appointed. And then the Houthis, who have been claiming autonomy in the north of the country, actually have stormed in and taken over. And it is thought, or at least accused by the Saudis, they've done this with Iranian funding. So the Saudis, and you can't see Yemen, it's fallen off the map, but it's underneath the yellow state. So the Saudis are feeling very vulnerable and may actually also have to spend money on a military venture. They have actually deployed troops down to the borders of Yemen in the past, but actually to unseat the Houthis. Yemen is a heavily and densely populated state, maybe quite a tall order. It's also the case that the Saudis have, along with others in the Gulf, have been subsidizing the new government since the Muslim Brotherhood were removed in Egypt to the tune of $20 billion a year, which, you know, in the overall scheme of things may not be that much. They're not paying all of that. The Kuwaitis are contributing, as is the UAE. But this is also something which can't be sustainable over the longer term. So I think there may be some vulnerabilities to the Saudis. They currently have very low debt, so they could actually borrow to cover the excesses. But there's a lot of debate, and perhaps we could debate this, those of you who are energy specialists here, as to why the Saudis have not actually restricted their exports and output in order to try and control supply. It was thought at first they were keeping the price artificially low to see off competition from US shale oil, but I think the US sector has shown some resilience in this respect. Smaller operators with high operating costs obviously are heavily leveraged and find it difficult to continue, but I don't think it's a way of seeing the end of the shale oil revolution. There's another theory that they were doing it to punish the Russians. You know, the Russians are in some difficulty economically. They have a heavy dependence on oil and gas exports, and the Russians, having been seen to be on the wrong side on the Syria equation, might be punished. But I suspect the real reason is another one put forward, which is if the Saudis restrict their supplies to the market, others will fill others will fill their place, because the market is actually oversupplied relative to demand, which is, you know, another reason for oil prices having dropped. Another aspect, and I think I'll finish on this, is in the energy equation certainly, is what if Iran comes back on track? Iran, as you probably know, is under some extensive US and international sanctions, although in terms of its own oil exports, it's, I think, got the 5th largest reserves in the world, and obviously has not been able to export as much as it has in the past. But at present, one of the limiting factors is the nuclear program negotiations being led by what's called the P5+1. It's the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, which have an interim, I mean, they had an original deadline which was passed in November last year, but as you've probably seen with the speech, the very prominent speech of President Netanyahu of Israel in Congress saying anything but a deal with Iran, there is in fact some progress has been made. I mean, the details we could go through, but which involve Iran exporting some of its low-enriched uranium stockpiles to Russia, and various safeguards and monitoring. It will accept the extended protocol of the IAEA, which is the inspection agency in Vienna. And there are a number of ways in which we could finally see this question resolved to everyone's satisfaction, in which case Iranian oil could in itself actually damage the long-term oil price for states like Saudi Arabia. Now, whether in fact any of this is going to burst at the seams in ways that affect energy security remains to be seen. I mean, the biggest risk, it seems to me, is for some kind of next layer of tension to escalate between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But I think Saudi Arabia is still in a position where it expects others to not only fight its battles for it, even though it's acquired quite a considerable stockpile of its own in terms of military weaponry in recent years, but would actually back off from confronting Iran, which is extremely able, tactically and strategically, to cause quite a lot of damage, particularly in the Straits of Hormuz, which is the major gateway, if you like, for oil exports out of the Gulf area. So I think I'll leave it there. I'd rather hear from you about what you would like to know more about.